So in essence, what's happening here is when we create this display object, it's going to get the attributes that are set up as the default. And one of those default values is texture wrapping repeat. We've just set it, and so from then on, this specific display object will remember that it is set up to do repeating, whereas anything created after this statement will be back to clamp to edge. So if I had left this and just left it as repeat, every other display object I created after this would have wrapping set for repeat, which is not necessarily what we want. So again, set the state, then we create a single object, a rectangle, and then we use the filling technique where we say fill is equal to, and then a table where the type is image, and we give the file name as smiley. And let me see if I can show you this image here. So it's in HUD trick, and we just have an image, a little smiley image. And then we reset the state. And then below here, I added a variable called value. I could have called it anything I wanted, but as long as it doesn't conflict with existing fields on the display object, we're good to go. So value is equal to 1. I'm assuming that a counter will start at 1. I mean, this is a very, for people who are looking at this, they could modify this later and give it like a default value. So something tricky like that. Now they can say create new HUD at this position and say start at 3, and then our value would start at 3. But for simplicity's sake, this example will start at 1. The only other thing we do here is I attach a method to the HUD called setValue, and it takes an argument self and an argument value. And then when we do this, when we call this function or this method, it will update the value to whatever we've passed in. It will do a small check, and it will say if the value is equal to 0, basically hide the HUD, don't show it at all. However, in any other case, if it's assuming that the person doesn't pass in a negative value, which would be an error for this, I don't have any error checking in this code. So I try to make it as simple as possible. Assuming that you pass in a numeric value greater than 0, it will show itself. It will set the X scale to be that value. And then what we will do is a little trick here. So one of the things that goes on is when you initially set wrapping, let me show you what happens here so this makes more sense. When you initially set wrapping, everything is appropriately scaled. However, if I scale the object and do not adjust the fill scale, I get this weird stretching, which is not what I want. So there's two things going on. We need to scale the object, which is make it twice as wide. In fact, let me show you. Let me make a small change here. This is so it's a little more apparent. I'm going to put a stroke around the object. You can see the outer border. Now we can see the outside border. So when I click here, this is going to scale. Now the object is twice as wide as it was before. So the X scale is set to 2, which is the current value. However, it's stretching. It's doing something weird. And the reason is fill values. So we set up a fill value here. They have this property where you can scale the fill value to whatever you want. And if you want to retain the original aspect ratio of this fill, the fill scaling has to be the inverse, where is it, of the scale. So what I'm saying here is, if we scale it to be twice as wide, the fill has to be 1/2. If we scale it to be 3 times as wide, the scale of the fill has to be 1/3. So this is kind of a strange concept at first. How do I express this better? Other than to tell you that it is a fact, I'm not sure how to express this. I think for people who are watching this is simply go into the code on line 43 and do what I did just a moment ago. Go ahead and comment that out, and then run it, and then scale it increment it a few times, and you can see what's going on here. These things are getting more and more horizontally stretched, which is what we do.
Well,
we want it to look horizontally stretched, but we want the fill to be appropriately sized. And to do that, mathematically, is we just need to scale it by the inverse of the object scale. I don't know how else to say that.
That's okay. So knowing that this is a fact is important. Okay.
Yeah. Right. So I'm still adjusting to the new format here.
But what was how did you come to understand this problem and then find a solution for it?
How did I come to... I came to understand this problem by already understanding this problem. How did I learn it the first time? The first time I learned it in a textbook when I was reading about scaling and textures and OpenGL.
Okay, so this is just a general OpenGL scaling issue then.
Yeah, it's more fundamental than that. We can forget about OpenGL. If you think about it, if you had a stretchy piece of rubber or something like that, like a balloon, and it had a face on it, and you stretched that thing out horizontally, the face would get wider, right? It would no longer have retained its original aspect ratio. So if you wanted to retain the original aspect ratio, you'd have to do some kind of math to change that. And so when I say aspect ratio, what I'm talking about is the ratio of the width to the height, or the height to the width, depending on how you want to think about aspect ratios. So if I make it twice as wide, and I want to retain the visual aspect ratio of the same width versus height, I need to divide by the width. So I make the object wider, but then when I fill it, the fill content is 1 over the width.
Okay.
Yeah, it's one of those fundamental things where you do it, and you say, if you're learning this sort of like organically, without a textbook, you're just plugging along, trying to figure things out. This is one of those things where you would suddenly discover, aha, now I see, now I understand how the fill ratio works with respect to the actual scale.
Okay,
so I could modify. Go ahead.
Well, then just in the context of Corona, how where did you begin to look to say, oh, well, I've run into this problem before, I understand this issue, let me find the way to deal with it in Corona?
Well, honestly, okay, so originally I knew when I scaled something with a fill that had a fixed fill scale, and then it stretched, I remembered immediately, yes, I have to scale the fill. And then I remembered that there was an article, let me see if I can find it here, there was a great article by Rob on scaling, and I think you can simply find this by typing in Corona SDK.
Yeah, my point in asking all that is just, so that people can kind of work this out for themselves when they run into these kind of issues later on.
Yeah, so I typed in the words Corona SDK, and I think you just type in fill, and up came Repeating Fills, an article that I believe Rob wrote, which is a great article on fills and how they work, and he talked about this exact problem too, with texture wrapping, and then a little bit further down, scaling the fill. And so he probably did a little more succinct job of describing what's going on here. But if you look at the article, it's going to talk both about horizontal and vertical scaling relative to the fill scale and how those two affect each other. So.
Okay.